If you're looking to level up your hair creation techniques, I'd like to share with you a new and highly experimental method that I've been using on my last few characters, using the newly added CurveAlpha brush. This is another curve-based solution like the previous one, but with a few extra steps and an added level of complexity that can go a long way in adding substantial depth and detail. This is what I used to achieve this hairstyle for my Link model. The basic workflow is fairly similar to the previous method. You choose a curve brush and drag it along a mesh to create a shape. However, unlike the previous method, which created the strand based on a predefined IMM, the CurveAlpha brush allows the shape to be dictated by the alpha image that is attached on the left. Essentially, it directly converts the bitmap information into geometry, which means that whatever shape you have in your alpha will be represented in the strand. Let's grab the star alpha for example. Using this as my image, you can see that the root of the strand corresponds to the shape of the star. This opens up a lot of exciting possibilities, since it allows you to have a far greater degree of control over the parameters and complexity of your strand. You can use whichever alpha you want, depending on the shape that you're going for, but the one I've been using is alpha 23. As you can see, the spots in the alpha generate additional thin meshes inside the strand, which we can then move around to create a more organic and detailed shape. I would also suggest inflating the subtool to give the meshes a bit of thickness. We need to split up the meshes into separate polygroups. As you can see, hitting other groups isn't giving us the desired result. This is because the tips of the meshes are welded together. To fix this, simply remove the welded geo and hit other groups again. This will give you separate polygroups which you can then freely manipulate. Now that we got that out of the way, let's get started with our third and final hairstyle. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of polygons here, and this kind of is going back to what I mentioned earlier about using curve step. So curve step pretty much, dictates how dense your new curve mesh is going to be. So if you find it a little bit too difficult to kind of manipulate the shape using move and it starts getting all wobbly, so you can either adjust the curve step or you can just manually delete edge loops using Z modular, which is something I do a lot. But don't fight the topology, right? If you feel like it's too low poly or too high poly, then just adjust it accordingly until you get something that is easier for you to control. So just to give a bit of background about this technique, basically for years I've been using the Dylan brushes that I went over in the last chapter. And for the most part, they gave me really good results. But after a few years, I felt like it was kind of getting a little bit stale and just a little bit predictable, right? Because looking at my characters, I try to show a little bit of variety, and I felt like the hair was starting to look very repetitive. Now, for a lot of hairstyles, it works just fine because it's a pretty simplified way to do stylized hairstyles. But when I got to my Link model, I really wanted to try something that's a little bit more detailed and a little bit out of my comfort zone. So I always try to mix in a little bit of realism in my stylized. I think my characters are far from realistic, but there's a lot of certain details that I try to add in that make them a little bit, more detailed than some of the anime characters you might come across. And I think with Link, the hair was one thing I really wanted to focus on because the way he interacts with it is pretty unique, and that was actually one of my main draws. So I was experimenting with all kinds of different techniques when I came across a tutorial from the Zebra Summit. I think it was 2021. by Ashley A. Adams. So she did a pretty short 11-minute video kind of going over this new feature called CurveAlpha. And she basically detailed some of the ways to use it. And from that point, just kind of started experimenting with it and really opened a lot of things up for me. I think currently I'm still far from, using it ideally, I would say, just because I feel like a lot of it is sort of feels manual, and a little bit cumbersome sometimes. So I think ideally, I would at a certain point I would definitely want to create my own alpha, because this one, while it gives you a lot of control, it can also go wrong very quickly. Because A, as you can see, it's very high poly, and B, it creates a bunch of different meshes, right? I don't know if it corresponds to the name of the actual alpha, but let's say it's over 20 meshes that are generated every time you do this process of creating a new curve and then creating the polygroups. So it can get a little bit messy. So you have to be very careful with it, and you have to be very deliberate about the way that you kind of shape your hair, so it doesn't go too crazy, right? Because one thing I really like to emphasize with my characters is, simplicity is key. Like the more you have going on, the bigger a distraction it can be. And I feel like with this technique, I've tried it on a few characters where it just didn't work at all. Like I would try several different approaches, but it just felt like it was starting to betray the simplicity of the character. So you really gotta think about whether this workflow is gonna work for the hairstyle that you have planned. Because again, it's not a one size fits all kind of thing. I think if I wanted to use this method, for example, for the first hairstyle, the short one, it wouldn't necessarily work because I think with that one, those that spiky hair and those really big, bold, clear shapes worked really well with the method that I was using. But trying to mix that up with sort of this super detailed multi-strand workflow would not necessarily have worked. So that's why I wanted to go with this hairstyle. I thought this would be a really good candidate for this kind of workflow, just because a it's very much affected by gravity and just the overall posture. I wanted to feel like it's sort of like mid motion almost. Like she's just turning around, which is one thing that I've tried with a lot of my characters, especially when you do the 360. A lot of times the comment I get is it looks animated even though it's not, which is exactly what I'm going for. Just trying to make the hair feel alive and dynamic even when it's completely still. And you do that by really depicting some sort of motion or in just the way that you angle the hair. And obviously that has to work in harmony with the pose itself. It has to make sense, right? So you just gotta think about these things. And if a certain workflow, it doesn't work, don't be afraid to just kind of scrap that and go with a different technique. I do that all the time. Just because you've put in some work doesn't mean that you have to follow along with it if you feel like there might be better alternatives, right? That's not to say that you can't make it work. If you give it enough time and patience, you can make most things work, but it's not necessarily always the right approach. So nowadays, I primarily use this technique just because I feel like it's given me the most control. So my latest character, which is Cammy from Street Fighter 6 with her new design, which I love by the way, I also employed this technique. And I felt like that worked out really well. But again, for Lucy from Cyberpunk that I did, I just used regular Geo. Same for Gus Fring from Breaking Bad that I also did a couple of months ago. So obviously, this type of solution wouldn't work for a character like Gus Fring. It just wouldn't make any sense. So yeah, just kind of think about those things in advance before you get started. So one more question I get quite a lot is why I don't use XGen or Natrix or a lot of other sort of simulation hair. And the reason for that is, well, it's twofold. So the main reason is that I like to create the cell shaded render in ZBrush, which you can't really do with XGen. XGen kind of works with traditional rendering engines like Arnold or V-Ray, and you can probably convert that to Geo and just render that out in ZBrush. That's true, but I kind of do the opposite. Like I kind of work in reverse in that way, where I like to work with Geo, and then if I want, I can convert that to XGen. So that's the main reason. The second reason, which is pretty similar, is I like to 3D print most of my characters. Obviously, you can't 3D print simulated hair. It has to be converted into Geo. So I kind of like that extra degree of control, and I just like working with Geo in general. I think in terms of rendering, I'm the kind of person who kind of likes immediate results. That's why I work in games. I really like seeing what you're doing pretty pretty instantly, I guess, in a way. I'm as a generally I'm not a big fan of waiting forever for a render to finish. So I kind of like that immediate satisfaction. And I think rendering in ZBrush really gives you that because there's little to no downtime when you're rendering. The renders are pretty much instantaneous. Again, depending on what kind of render you do in ZBrush, but the one that I use, which is just a straight up cell shaded BPR render, you get pretty immediate results. And I like doing it while I'm working on the hair simultaneously. As I mentioned earlier, that way I can make sure that things are kind of tailor made to work with the specific rendering method that I went for. Because again, I don't like working in a vacuum. The same goes for Arnold, right? I also, in addition to the cell shaded render, I render a lot of my characters in Arnold as well, and that process is a little bit more involved because that requires taking the model outside of ZBrush, basically into Maya. And once you do that, then things can get a little bit tricky because you can't really use the poly paint as is. You have to kind of convert that into textures, or you can use vertex color, but you don't have as much control as you do when you're just doing everything in ZBrush. And you also have to set up your lights and you have to set up your own dedicated scene for that character. So that's one more thing I like to do. I like to kind of export out a work in progress version of the character that I'm currently working on, kind of import that into Maya and then do a test render, right? And gradually I would just, I would set that up as a reference so you don't have to constantly, re-import your model and manually position it every time. You can just set it up as reference, and whenever you overwrite your existing FBX, you can just reload it, and then all the new changes will be applied. So I like to do that fairly early on. That way I can change the sculpt accordingly. Like if I see that a certain hair mesh that looks great in ZBrush doesn't look quite right in Arnold, then I'm already working on that, right? I haven't finalized anything. So I can just kind of adjust it and kind of play around with it and then re-export it into Maya, and that solves it. So again, don't work in a vacuum. Working in a vacuum is just gonna cause a lot of a lot of heartache later when you feel like you're done, and then you'll notice that it's just not working out as great as you had hoped. one of the most common brushes that I use for this particular process is pinch and inflate. Because using the alpha, you get pretty similar looking sort of spheres that those make up the different meshes that you're eventually splitting up with polygroups. But you don't want them to look too repetitive. So I like to kind of isolate specific groups and just kind of pinch and inflate them. So you have one strand that's kind of thicker and one that's thinner, and one that kind of tapers off at the bottom, and another one that is just a little bit more, thin to thick or thick to thin. I think that's just, if you look at hair in general, that's kind of how it works, right? It sort of like coalesces and then splits up, and then it kind of gets intertwined with each other. So trying to make it visually interesting. So you'll notice the back of the head is kind of starting to feel a little bit stringy, or, like mom's spaghetti. So I'm really trying to create a little bit of variation. I take some of the smaller strands, I duplicate them, and I just kind of overlap them on top of the other one just to break up the flow so it doesn't feel super repetitive. And that's one area where kind of painting it a different color helps. I added in a little bit of shadow, a little bit of highlights, and colored those smaller strands a lighter color. And also just kind of playing around with the rotation, right? You want to break up some of the bigger shapes just to create a little bit of variation. So always try to do that. Obviously, try to think about what makes the hair feel organic, right? Just copy pasting the same hair mesh won't necessarily cut it because hair just doesn't behave that way. No matter how cleanly you try to kind of to arrange it. It's made up of thousands of different follicles and strands, and you want to try to depict that as much as you can while still keeping it fairly simple and fairly clean. So always think about big shapes versus smaller shapes, variation, breakup, uniqueness of the strands, just to really try and make it dynamic and organic. And I know that's something that I've brought up a few times before, but that is really the focal point of this whole method and just my approach to 3D in general, right? Less is more. The less you have, the more cleanly it reads. And I think with this approach, that kind of challenges it because it's almost the opposite, right? Because you're essentially complicating things to a pretty great degree compared to some of my other techniques. So I think with this one, it's really a challenge to keep it simple while also being very detailed. So don't let it get too crazy. Remember your hair groups. Keep it, that's why I like to keep it in separate subtools. So each subtool has 20 something different polygroups that I can kind of manipulate freely. But don't lose track of, what consists of your hair groups. So the last thing I want to talk about, and it's somewhat unrelated to hair, but I feel like it's super important, is comfort zone. I think as artists, we all have our initial, inclination to work on a certain type of body type or a certain type of gender or race or ethnic background, whatever. I know that for me, for years, I sculpted primarily women because that's what I used to sketch growing up. I've always been more familiar with the female anatomy, when it comes to art, and I just kind of enjoy that more in general. And I felt like, whenever I deviated from that, then I wouldn't get the same reception, right? And that's years ago, right? And I just kept doing the same thing that I knew because I knew that I was getting the biggest bang for my buck, and I didn't have to really challenge myself. And then at a certain point, I think it was like maybe 5 years ago, a very well-known studio, which I won't name, they called me over for an interview, and they told me, listen, your portfolio is great, but why do you only do women? Like, is there anything else that you know how to do, or is that the only thing you can do? Now, at that point, I was freelancing a lot, so I did everything from cartoony to realistic to animation. But, I didn't put any of that up on my portfolio. I would just put the stuff that I do in my free time, and that has always been women. And that statement kind of shocked me because it's almost like calling me out for not having enough versatility. So like at first, it almost offended me, but then I realized that that is like the best critique that I could have gotten because it's one thing to be really good at just making one type of character, same facial features, same body type, and that's great, but you want to be able to do more than that. If you want to work in the industry, you're not just gonna do what you want to do. Sometimes you'll have to create characters that are the complete opposite of something that you would choose to do yourself, be it stylistically or even in terms of of features, body features or facial features and all of that. And I wanted to prove to myself that I am able to do a lot more than just women. So if you go to my portfolio now, you'll notice a bit of a shift that started back in 2020 when I did Vivi from Final Fantasy IX, because that is obviously completely different from most things that I had before. And after that, I decided that for each female character that I make, I'm gonna make a male character as well. It started with Omni-Man from Invincible, and then I did Link, who is actually my most successful and popular piece ever, which, to me was a great degree of satisfaction because I proved to myself that I'm able to create a really appealing piece of work, even, when it's outside of my comfort zone. I felt like that gave me a lot more tools to be able to tackle other subjects. So, that kind of stuff really helps me with my job as well in multiverses. As I mentioned before, I do a lot of characters that I wouldn't necessarily do for my own portfolio. Tom and Jerry, Bugs Bunny, Steven Universe, very simplified characters. But I feel like making the decision to challenge myself all those years ago is really paying off now because I'm able to be a lot more versatile than I've ever been. So, yeah, that's definitely my tip to you. Don't always go with what you know. Sometimes try the exact opposite. And you will find that, it's gonna pay off in the long run. Congratulations! You now have the knowledge and tools to create your very own stylized hairstyle in ZBrush. As with all things, this will require a good amount of time and patience to get right, but the more you practice, the better you will become. Thanks for watching this course. I truly hope you found it informative and enjoyable. See you next time!